Magee, I can say on behalf of all of us that it's an honour to speak to you right now. We're joined today by Shaka Hislop, who's our honorary president, Tosca Fairchild, who's our chair, and Jed Grebby, our chief executive. Do you want to just start off by just talking to us a little bit about your background and about what it is that you do?
I am trained as an economist and a theologian. I trained here in the United States. I currently am based in the UK, in London, where I'm a senior fellow at University College London, and I'm a visiting professor of social justice at Newcastle University. So my work has integrated a couple of theological thoughts around justice and equality. I position an argument, an academic argument, that Moses went to Mount Sinai and came down with 10 public policies. And those public policies inform society, culture, justice, and law, therefore framing a conversation around ethics, public theology, and the theology of law. In addition to that, I worked with this New Testament narrative of Jesus's argument that the poor you will have with you always, and deconstructing that to provide a more deep perspective that it was not this Jesus's notion that we would not be able to eradicate poverty, but rather he was talking from the context of what was happening in the moment with his disciples around his impending death, and that he was not saying that we could not eliminate or alleviate or eradicate poverty for a number of reasons, certainly because he was a Jew, and they believed that there shall be no poor amongst our kin, and that there was something very structural in their faith that did not believe that poverty could not be eradicated. So I've taken those two theological thoughts and brought them into the academic and public sphere to dismantle a lot of notions around ethics, theology, law, poverty, equality, and race. It is my hope that all of my work together as a body of work will be a major theme around justice, social justice, and how to ultimately deconstruct race. I'm glad to be with you all today.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over now to Jed for the first question.
Hi, Dr. Magee. We were introduced to you by the Vice Chancellor of Newcastle University, Chris Day, in particular because of the Shaka was due an honorary degree this July, but because of the pandemic, it was obviously postponed until next July, around the Martin Luther King visit to Newcastle University over 50 years ago. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your involvement, how you became involved in the Martin Luther King, with the Martin Luther King family, and your family's involvement with Martin Luther King himself.
So it's interesting. Yesterday in the United States was the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, the passing and the signing of the bill. And there was also a memorial to John Lewis, who recently died, who was one of the younger ones who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So my 6-year-old went with me to it, and I was the closing speaker to give the call to action. And when we got in the car, he said to me, "Papa, were you friends with Martin Luther King Jr.?" I said, "Not quite. I was actually in my mother's womb when Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. It would not be until 6 months later that I was actually born. However, my mother was Mrs. King's biographer. The last book that came out on Mrs. King that she sat with my mother to write, My Life, My Love, My Legacy, was about 10 years that my mother spent specifically with her, interviewing her long ago when we used cassette tapes. And so she was taping her life and her journey. And because of my mother's work with writing the book, we spent lots of time with the King family over a number of years. And so that's how I became engaged specifically with the King family and have known them, I would say, some 30 years now. My mother, of course, has known them longer. She is a journalist here in the US and was on the scene very early, even for the Fred Hampton murder in Chicago. So this whole issue of social justice and civil rights and equality dates back while I was in the womb and my parents were at rallies and marches. And so I was born with an awareness of Martin Luther King Jr. and Joseph Lowery and Andrew Young and all of these folks were my mother's friends. My father had a different set of individuals that he was exposed to and a part of because he's from Louisiana. And my family was a part of the Deacons for the Defense down in Louisiana. So very long history engaged in the civil rights movement in America.
Why do you think Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy is so important, and why do you think it's lasted in being so vibrant now?
I think for a number of reasons. I think that Dr. King's message was prophetic. He was willing to die for what he believed in. He was well trained and equipped to purport the notion of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness, which is where Du Bois argued in The Talented Tenth and the Souls of Black Folks, that you have to be able to be conscious of yourself as an African American and conscious of how the others in the world perceive you. And King was able to walk that fine line, being double conscious, to say, how do I continue to be a Black Baptist preacher who is conscious of the issues that are facing Blacks, African Americans, and how do I meet them? And how do I understand pluralism, as having studied at Boston University and receiving a PhD in systematic theology. So King was able to function in both worlds. He was able to enjoy fried chicken and collard greens, and he was also able to go to Oslo and receive the Nobel Peace Prize. So King was in both worlds, and being in both worlds, being accepted in both worlds, he became the leader of the movement and understood the breadth and the depth of it, and why America needed to make good on its bounce check, how those insufficient funds needed to become a reality. And then he mobilized a team of people who were strategic to understand that it was not just about lofty sermons, it was not about a hashtag, perhaps for their generation, but it was about saying what we want. There's something that we need that creates equality. There's something that we must do to cause the uncivil to become civilized. And so the ideal was equal protection under the law. And that's why King's efforts were so amazing, because he was able to mobilize, he was able to understand that it was about law, it was about policy, it was about humanity. And he was able to form an ecumenical group of faith leaders to mobilize to call for a righteous America.
I watched one of your videos online, Dr. Magee, and there was a comment that you made in relation to the Martin Luther March, where you referenced that there were as many Black women with fried chicken as there were white women making sandwiches. And it just struck me that this is what we are absolutely seeing with the Black Lives Movement, where we are seeing an increase of white people joining in the march. So we may come back to that point later on, but I thought it was very pertinent to have to add on to this discussion.
Sure.
That's a perfect introduction. My next question is what do you make of the, I don't know if you want to comment on the murder of George Floyd. If you do that, that's absolutely fine, but also the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement that's gone all over the world since then.
So I certainly can comment on the Black Lives Matters movement and the unfortunate murder of George Floyd. When the Black Lives Matters movement started, it was certainly and remains necessary to talk about the police brutality in the United States and the fact that Black and brown bodies are virtually being murdered by a demographic of white American police officers, which created the movement. And so I'm often rattled and challenged by the fact that everything that is happening with Black people now is under a hashtag Black Lives Matters, because certainly Black Lives Matters. The movement was about and remains to be about the fact of the disproportionate deaths of Black and brown bodies by a particular demographic of white police officers. Something has to be done about that. When I met with the group and spoke with the group early on, I said, what do you want? What is it that you want to accomplish so that we don't have a hashtag, but that your movement is fulfilled? And it was at that moment that I suggested to them that we look at federal law to make a difference, because if we would continue with the hashtag, I was afraid that the movement would be lost in momentum and outgrow itself to represent talking about Black and brown skin and not talking about police brutality that is happening disproportionately against Black and brown bodies by a particular demographic of white men. And we have seen the continuation of this because the group did not know specifically what it wanted. It has certainly created a movement that has gone viral, that has brought about a consciousness about Black and brown people in the world. However, that movement has not done anything that has stopped the murders of these bodies. And that's where my challenge lies, because we still have to do something about it. As the world is taking on the issues of race, and they're now seeing everything that is happening with Black and brown people because of George Floyd being murdered, which was horrific, which was horrifying, which was wrong. Those police officers need to be held to the rule of law as anyone else. I was recently in a conversation where they said they should be charged as Black men killing a white man, and seeing whether or not the same rule of law would apply to them based upon how race is seen. So this is a very unfortunate situation. And I, for one, did not grasp for my breath. I did not fall and faint and say, my God, what is happening in America? Why? Because when I was 9 years old, living in the bayou of Louisiana, a 15-year-old cousin was drowned by some white boys because he had dated, kissed, had some experience with a young white girl. So since the age of 9, I've known about Black and brown bodies being taken by white men and have lived through this experience my entire life. What we have that we did not have in the 1970s are smartphones with cameras that could record what was happening. You have to realize the efforts of the civil rights movement came at a head when the news stations in America decided to do the coverage of what was happening and the brutality that was happening to Black bodies who wanted civil rights and the rights to vote. When that went national, when that hit the press, Lyndon Johnson didn't have a choice. He had to do something about it because the world could see what was happening in America. Though this is our same moment where the world now sees what's happening in America and is saying, why is something disproportionately happening to Black and brown people? And now we're trying to wrestle to do something about it because of George Floyd, which I think is amazing. I think that Vice President Joe Biden was right in his statement of saying that his life will be more significant in some ways than Martin Luther King Jr's, because now the world is doing something not about King, but about what happened to George Floyd. We see it. There are marches all over the world because of George Floyd, who did not have a PhD from Boston University, who was not well trained, but was a regular human being going about his daily life, making a very small error, if you estimate, did a bounce check, an invalid check of $20 cost a life? How do you measure those two things? So you know, Black Lives Matter certainly is necessary. It needs to move forward. It needs to get what it wants around federal law. There are lots of things that can be done with that. George Floyd's life mattered, and that's where we are. I hope, as I was speaking with some students on yesterday, that are on university campuses in the UK, talking about the disproportionate number of Black and brown students on campuses, and how jarring it is to go away from their families in urban areas and end up in these universities that are a bit remote, and they feel like they do not belong, that are taken on the hashtag, Black Lives Matters, for their movement to not do that. Take the Black Lives Matters movement as something to galvanize and to mobilize, but create your hashtag about what matters to you, and then move it forward so that you can actually resolve what it is that are your specific issues, and then have outcomes that you want to ensure happens as a part of that movement.
Can I jump in here, Jay? Dr. Magee, first of all, I'm still a little bit rattled after your personal account regarding your cousin. It's jarring to hear. But I live in a very wide suburb of Boston, and as I drive around my own town, there are any number of Black Lives Matter placards in front yards, etc. And so the movement has taken on a wider meaning around systemic racism, as opposed to just, or maybe justice is the wrong term here, as opposed to police brutality against Black and brown people. But living in the suburb that I do, I also recognize the need to have those conversations with our white neighbors, with our white friends. How do we take that wider conversation and, as you put it, get Black Lives Matter back on focus in terms of what they want in addressing federal law?
Well, I think that it is certainly good to have everybody engaged in the conversation, and that the movement created that. I think the way to get people, everyone engaged in this conversation around race, that are now conscious, or as they say, woke, that I think a lot of people are actually sleepwalking and not necessarily woke, but I appreciate the fact that they're in motion. I think that it is critical to have honest and brave conversations. We often talk about safe spaces. I think we have to talk about brave spaces. We have to talk about these issues head on, not pretend that they don't exist, not believe that we're in a post-racial society, but we have to talk about the issue of race. What is it? How is it constructed? Race is solidly a political construct. It was created predominantly by whites in America that were a part of the slave trade, and understood that their ethnicity would not save them from the mass number of African slaves that had been brought to America, had been exchanged and sold in England, and that there were more of them from different places throughout the continent of West Africa, and that if they did not mobilize as a unit, that these slaves could revolt and take over. So those who saw themselves as German and Dutch, and French and British and Swedish decided to become white together, to mobilize as a unit for oppression and for economic gain. Let's start there as an honest conversation. Let's talk about what science did to further inform and construct it. Let's talk about what the church did to further form and instruct it. When we talk about all those things, then we can have an honest conversation. That's where we start. And be brave. And what I think is most important is to create spaces for white men who are being called into question around the leaders of this police brutality, for them to come together and have an honest conversation. What do you hope to gain? What's your fear? Where's your fragility? What's the issue of your power? What does this represent to you? Where is your ethereal essence, your soul, your morality, your reasoning? Do you see Black and brown bodies as human beings? Mm-hmm. Am I more? Am I less? Deal with the eugenics of it. We have to have these deep conversations. You know, we were walking through the woods, the forest here in Milton, Massachusetts, me and my son, and a tree had turned over and he could see the roots. And he said to me, how do we get those roots back in the ground and stand this tree up? And I said to him, that's impossible. Most people don't want to deal with the roots. They only want to deal with the leaves. We have to deal with the roots of these issues. We cannot deal with the leaves. We cannot do kumbaya moments. We cannot hug and pat each other on the shoulder. We cannot say because we are interracial or biracial or our children grow up in these mixed communities that we've resolved the issues. If we don't understand our history, we can never inform our future.
Just my final, well, we'll go one more question after this, but the in terms of the most effective way, well, how do you see the most effective way of combating racism? I think you've just given us a classic lesson in that, but that's the question I have for you.
That's my answer. To have brave conversations. I am a product of my great-great-grandparents. It is their vision for my great-grandparents and grandparents to have a fair chance in the world. So everything that I've obtained, the spaces that I live in and realize daily, is because of something that was done 4 generations ago. We cannot be naive to believe that we will wake up tomorrow or even in our lifetimes and this issue be resolved. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. How do we bend it a little further in our lifetimes to ensure that at some point it has been fully bent to it's a straight line towards justice? That's our role and our responsibility, to say, what is it that I can do to point or bend this moral compass a little further so that we can at some point get there? I believe it will take 4 generations from now to deconstruct race, but that's hard work. And it has to be a space that is committed in the academic community, in business community, athletic community, entertainment community, science, medicine, engineering, architecture. Every community has to look at it, whether that is expanding the canon to ensure that Black women, Asian women are included in the canons as it relates to literature around economics, or whether that is ensuring that there's equality on football teams throughout Europe and there is no issue with Black and brown players, whether that is who's writing screenplays in Hollywood, or whether that is who is managing the International Monetary Fund. We have to do it in every possible space, and no space should be left unturned. And that is what this moment in history has done. Everyone is saying, because of George Floyd's murder, what can we do to change the world? And we have to keep pace at that. My fear is that this moment would end with George Floyd, that in 6 months, it would be over. But then I realized America has not dealt with its soul and its sin, and that it's inevitable. I got another video yesterday of a man in a police department being murdered, literally taped accidentally by someone, where he's in a chair being suffocated and choked to death. So it's not going away. We now have film, we have footage that's showing what's going on. So now we will, if the only way that this stops is if technology goes down and there's no way to record and to disseminate this information. We've got hard days ahead, but we can do it. It takes the efforts of all. Yeah.
I wanted to touch on the wider impact of the George Floyd death on the focus on Black Lives Matter, specifically around the pandemic and the spotlight that is shone globally on how the inequality, the systemic racism that you so very clearly articulated is now showing up in terms of health inequalities and having a higher proportion of Black and brown people dying because of the pandemic. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts and views around that.
Well, certainly health disparity globally is a phenomenon because of access to healthcare. And you are correct with George Floyd's death. Everything that's happening in this moment in this movement has shown and revealed the fact that health disparity is a phenomenon. There's a lot of work that has been done about that. It's being done around health disparity, but there's so much more work to be done. There are two things that I think are essential. Number one is to ensure that access is made available and that every individual is responsible themselves to taking on that access. With the NHS, one would think that everyone would have access to healthcare, and they do. Of course, we have populations of people that may have not been in the country legally, and therefore that could be some of the issues. That's everywhere, not just in the UK, certainly in the US as well. I think that there's a self-responsibility that needs to be looked at deeply with Black and brown people themselves to access the healthcare that is available. I know in lots of communities, there are no GPs or primary care physicians, as we would say in the United States, that they just don't exist because it's not something that has been brought deeply into the culture with that kind of meaning that it should have. And I'm hoping that now this pandemic has taught us to take hold of the services that are available to us, as well as to call into account and responsibilities those who are in the healthcare industry to understand what they're dealing with. And what I mean by that is if you realize that there's a demographic of people that have not signed up for GPs and do not have primary care physicians, then when a pandemic like this hits, you need to put together real emergency response teams that goes to the people rather than trying to have the people to come to you, because as the leaders of healthcare, that this will affect this demographic. So you have to be very specific in what you would provide to them during such a time period as this. And that is where government and these systems has failed Black and brown people specifically during COVID-19. But this is a long history. My best friend is chief of the VA hospital in San Francisco, but all of his research that he started 30 years ago was on health disparities that were happening and why Black and brown people ended up in the A&E or the emergency room. And so we've been looking at this for a very long time.
Dr. Magee, just thank you very much. Finally, from me, my final question here is a little bit more self-serving. Sure, Racism and Red Card see ourselves as being part of that educational community that you mentioned previously. What are some of the broader conversations, and I accept that maybe you don't know some of the inner workings of our organizations, but what are some of the bigger and broader conversations should we be having internally in our own efforts to bend that arc, as you mentioned?
The first question I would ask is, are we talking to ourselves? Are we interviewing people who think like us and that will promote our work? Or are we brave enough to talk to the people who don't think like us, who do not believe like us? At Newcastle University, we're in the process of renaming, perhaps, the Armstrong Building, and it became a part of the Black Lives Matters movement. And everyone is saying we need to do something to have a response. And as I've been added to the committee by the VC, I said to him and to the entire committee that I don't think we need to change the name of the building to the Armstrong King Building. I think we should change the name of the building to the Armstrong Richardson Building to talk about Armstrong and Anna Richardson, a white woman in Newcastle who helped to raise the 150 pound to buy Frederick Douglass's freedom. When do we create the space for white people to talk to white people about race and equality and why some white people get it and some white people don't? That's a good place to start. To be brave, to be honest, to be willing to go beyond your comfort zone, that you might hear and reason with other people. 90% of the people in my sphere don't think like me. They don't function and live like me because I'm always a student before I'm a teacher. I'm trying to learn, trying to be exposed to something so that I can go away and reason with it. Sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't. I would like to say, if I am able to, is something that is important that was mentioned earlier about everyone that was involved in the movement here in America, the civil rights movement, which I always tried to remind people was a movement to teach civil people, uncivil people, how to be civil. Those laws were created because uncivil people needed laws to teach them how to be civil so that Black and brown people could be protected. We make this imagery of the civil rights movement about, oh, the fight for equality, and Black people finally got it, but those people were being lynched, they were being hosed down, they were being shot, they were being bitten by dogs, toppled over, spat upon. And so laws had to be created to make folks civil. And in that movement, there are several demographics of people that were lost. And if you pull the frame back of the March on Washington, or even the signing of the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, if you pull the frame back from the 5 or 8 standing there, you will see on both sides are women. Women who were there, who were strategists, who were writing speeches, who were supporting the movement. And some of those women were white and Catholic and white and Jewish and African American. There were people there. There were Jewish rabbis, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose daughter Susanna Heschel is a dear friend that was with us on yesterday. He was there. Dorothy Day was a part of this movement. The list goes on and on. So we have to remember everyone that was a part of the movement that made it a reality. So in your work, remember everyone to be a part of the movement, not just an isolated group. Remember the voices of what has been called in a movie, the hidden figures, the women, the children, the whites, the Jews, the Catholics, everyone. Build a coalition of everyone who understands what it means to have a soul and that wants to fight towards a collective humanity.